So we'll just start off by saying that the canal is approaching its 300th anniversary. It was opened in 1742. It took 10 years to build, which seems very quick now when you consider how long it takes us to build things these days. So we just have to keep that in our mind, that it's one of the oldest pieces of infrastructure on the island of Ireland, as well as being the first summit level canal in both the UK and Ireland. So So I apologise for insulting people's intelligence, but I'm going to assume that nobody knows anything about canals just to get us underway. So why canals? And the answer is, you can see here, one horse, you can carry one sack, 100 kilos. If you put a cart behind the horse, don't be putting it in front of it. If you put the cart behind the horse, you can then carry maybe 1,000 kilos or 10 sacks. So you add a boat to the horse and you can carry 500 sacks. So you can see why a canal makes good sense and why anybody would want to build one if you were trying to transport goods around the country. So then the next question is, why the Newry Canal? Why did the Newry Canal end up being the first canal? And as anybody who ever studied geology will tell you, it's because of geology. Geology is the answer to everything. And in this case, that's quite right. So in the last ice age, we had a huge glacier that nibbled and gnawed its way southwards from Lough Neagh to what would become Carlingford Lough, digging away or eating away at the softer bedrock as it went. Then as the ice retreated and sea levels rose, we ended up with the classic U-shaped valley running from Lough Neagh to Carlingford, what became Carlingford Lough. So sea level rose and filled up the lough, but it left us in the rest of the interior U-shaped valley, it left us a huge big boggy morass that was more hindrance than a help to anybody. So we had the lough and the bog, and the bog was there for generations, and you can see there that it would have cut off County Down, and so we have the bog. The County Down people had the bog protecting them from the mad Armagh men across the way, and we maybe sometimes wish we might still have that bog, I don't know. Some of the echoes of the bog still remain, even though the canal has been there for 300 years. In some of the place names, like we have Points Pass, Gerald's Pass, and Scarva was Scarva Pass at a time. Scarva's original name was Ballagully, which is the pass of the Ulstermen. So these sort of names linger on, even though we've now forgotten why they were there. So the first person who probably isn't the first person ever to talk about making some sort of a channel between Lough Neagh and Newry, but the first one to be documented as having written about it and having actually done something about it was General George Monk, who was part of Cromwell's army in Ireland. And he had his soldiers dig some trenches in the area around Scarva as a way of helping him transport presumably people or goods, whatever. And later on then, two of the local landlords, Arthur Brownlow and Samuel Waring, I think he is, from Waringstown and Lurgan, there is letters in Prony between the two of them where they're saying that the channels that Monk had dug 40 years earlier could help them with their business of transporting goods up and down the countryside around their, delivering things around their estates. Excuse me. So you could see that people were thinking about how it would be good to both drain this huge bog and make channels for navigation and transport. So the earliest map that we have of the area is this, which does show some of the older names of the various different passes. And you can see this map then is from around 1690. Now I wonder what we were doing around Scarva in 1690. Yes, that's what we were at. So William is supposed to have come to Scarva, and it's quite likely that he did. He had his army were camped between Scarva and Lough Brickland, 2,000, maybe 3,000 men in preparation for what became the Battle of the Boyne. So I have this idea of William and his officers sitting up under the big chestnut tree at Scarva House, and the wee voice at the back saying,
but God, wouldn't it be a great thing to sail down on Bog to Newry?
And so a great idea was born. And the spooky thing about it is that one of the later engineers on the canal was Thomas Steers, and he had been with William at the Boyne. He was a soldier, a young soldier in William's army. So there is a chance that that wee voice at the back of the crowd was Thomas Steers. So after 1690, the first proper technical survey of the canal was done in 1703, ordered by the Irish Parliament by Captain Francis Neville, who was an engineer in the army. And this is a proper technical survey. It's very difficult to see, obviously. It's like a big long scroll map, and it has heights and what line that he would consider for a canal. So at this end here you have Lough Neagh, and this would be the beginnings of Portadown. So it's a wonderful map, this, for local history, and it has some landlord names on it as well. And this map there, it's in Proney, but there's also a copy of it in Armagh Local Studies Library, so you go and have a look at it. That's Lough Shark is there, and Scarva is there, and this is like the great mass of the bog, and on then more bogland. That would be Lough Brickland up there. So more bogland here, and then on into Newry here at the end, and on out to sea. So that was done in 1703 for Parliament. So they were obviously considering that a canal could be built, and various local landowners would be advocating for that to be done. But nothing happened. There was legislation in 1715 about draining bogs, but there was no money to back it up, so it was all aspirational. But finally, they did get their act together in 1729 with the Tillage Act, which was really a whole compendium of improvement goals. And improvement was one of the main drivers of 18th century construction. But this particular act was considered so successful because it brought together all shades of parliamentary opinion, that they could all rally around it. It had different things in it that suited different interest groups. So the first thing that it did was it set up the Commission for Inland Navigations. So these were a body of like a board of directors, and they would direct the different projects. So it's not just for the Newry Canal, this was a whole countrywide act, but the commissioners would be in charge of it. It was the main elements of it were to encourage tillage, which satisfied those who wanted Ireland to be more like England and have, as I think it's Arthur Young said about the country, smiling with agriculture. So that was, this is like taming the wild Ireland, all this kind of thing, make it more like England and more a patchwork of nice cultivated fields. And draining and improving bogs was part of that. Ireland was a colony, but the ruling classes wanted to be considered more of a sister kingdom than a colony. So they were very keen that Ireland should be improved and become more like England. Then there were, for the other types of people, then there was like the sort of social justice element in it, we would call it now, so the better employment of the poor. But that also was to do with economic nationalism as well. If you could employ people, you kept the money circulating within your own economy. Those people bought things, and the money didn't go abroad. That was one of the important things for the economic nationalists, was that you kept money in the country. And then the improving the carrying of goods inland. That was also to do with improving the economy. So altogether, this here was like an economic growth strategy. And then the most important thing about it was that it raised revenue. It gave the revenue from duties on luxury goods that were all detailed in the Act, and it gave that money to the board of the Commissioners for Inland Navigations, and it was up to them how it was spent, all to improve infrastructure within the country. So it was well funded, and it had quite a bold concept in that it was planning to do big infrastructure development, all to make Ireland more of a kingdom than a colony, as I said. So at the same time as they were doing this, they were building the Parliament House in Dublin. So it was all, that was an expression of their pride in their ability to govern and to be the equal of England, shall we say. That was all the subtext. But for all of that, the Newry Canal was kind of the focal point of all these different things. It was going to be the first thing that was the example of how this act would work in practice. So the canal project was led by the Surveyor General, Edward Lovett Pearce. But as I said, there was a lot of building work going on in Dublin at the time, so he put his chief engineer in charge, and that was Richard Castle. So Castle, a couple of years before this, had written an essay on artificial navigations, which detailed how a canal would be built, and this was what had drawn him to the attention of Pearce. So he was put in charge of the canal project. So Castle himself was a European. There's sort of like, it's a bit hazy as to who exactly he was, but it seems that he might have been a Sephardic Jew who was born possibly in the Netherlands or what became Germany, that kind of area. But his mother had been born in India, so he was a very sort of cosmopolitan guy. And he had worked in the previous years, he had travelled Europe studying canals and hydraulic infrastructure in France and the Netherlands. And France, in this time in 1729, France already had a summit level canal in the Canal de Briare, which had been opened in 1640, I think. So Castle was, essentially, he was an immigrant, and he says here in his introduction to the essay, he says that he is under the disadvantage of being a stranger in this kingdom and destitute of any other recommendation to your honours, the commissioners, than what hath arisen from the indulgence of the gentleman for whom I have conducted other works. So he was brought to Ireland to design houses for wealthy people, but his canal work drew them to the attention of Lovett Pearce. So, as I said, the culture of improvement is a big feature of the 18th century, and it brought together kind of science and arts together, and the complete person would have dealt with both sides of it. So Castle's in his essay, this is like the front cover or the front drawing, first drawing in it, and you can see that it is like it's like a romantic picture as well, with the big tree and the river, but it has the science element in the canal, and it's straight lines, and you can see there's a lock here at this end. And also he has in it too some of the like big country houses that he was busy designing at the same time and that he hoped to make his fortune doing. Just making sure I've got everything I want to talk about here as well. So this essay on inland navigations was like both a technical manual for how to build a canal, and also an essay on how canals worked. And some volunteers in our branch have transcribed and translated the work, and Castle's had a good grasp of hydrology and the physics and maths that went along with how a canal would work. This drawing here is how you would build the floor of a lock. So he's talking about lock construction, and he has very detailed drawings throughout the essay. And that is actually how the locks were built. So this is a picture then of one of the wooden lock sills that are on the Newry Canal. They are quite unique. I think there are about 6 of them in total on the canal, not all of them still existing, but they're quite unique, and because on the other canals in England and so on, they were generally renovated as time went by, but the Newry Canal, they were kept. So obviously some of the boards and stuff were replaced on this one, but whenever reconstruction work was done later, more recently, they were able to tell that some of the timber is probably original because it went in underneath the lock walls and didn't have any signs of being changed. So it's quite amazing to think that when this was built, the Battle of the Boyne was within living memory, and railways were still a century in the future. And this then is how that same wooden lock has been renovated and restored just last year by Armagh Banbridge Council. So the fact that this is all still standing and is unique is one of the things that we like to talk about in the Inland Waterways Association, that we actually have something like this, and so many people don't understand the importance of it, or why it should be celebrated. Okay, so Castle then, he started off building the canal in 1731, but his architectural career was taken off, and he was dismissed by the commissioners in about 1735 for spending too much time elsewhere. So this is like a biography of him that was written about 50 years after his death, saying that he was a man of integrity, of amiable though somewhat eccentric manners, kept poor by his improvidence, and long afflicted by gout resulting from intemperance and late hours. He sounds like a good sort of party guy, doesn't he? And he would be fun to meet. Apparently he was a terrible man to work for, and if he didn't like what had been what work had been constructed on his buildings, he would get them to tear it down as he came for his inspection and start all over again. So he was dismissed anyway, and he died in 1751, and he was replaced on the Newry Canal by Thomas Steers, who actually finished the canal then, and it was finished in 1742. So I'll just go through sort of the technical plan of the canal so that we all understand what we're talking about. So it's the first summit canal, as I said, in the UK and Ireland. Now, a lot of people said the first canal in the UK was the Bridgewater Canal. That wasn't finished for another 20 years. So a summit canal starts at sea level, rises up through the different locks to the summit, which is 23 metres high, and I'm reliably informed that that's the height of the spire in Newry Cathedral. So that's how high you get. And then there's a 3-mile summit length between Points Pass and Scarva, and then the canal then falls again from the summit, not quite to sea level obviously, because we go into the River Bann just after Moneypenny's Lock, and then into Lough Neagh, and you can continue down to sea level through the lower Bann and more locks. So the canal was opened, and this is from one of the Dublin newspapers about the first boat to arrive in Dublin, saying that it came into this harbour laden with coals, and being the first vessel that had come through the canal, had a flag on her topmast head and fired guns as she came up the channel. So it was obviously a big celebration because they had succeeded in building this thing that nobody had ever done before, and it was a very important day obviously. But I will use this slide here to debunk the coal theory. So the first thing I knew about the Newry Canal was it was built to transport coal from Coal Island to Dublin, and that is not true. I would argue against that. In Ireland, the economic nationalists who I was talking about earlier, they did have an obsession with coal. And Jonathan Swift, as always, had the pithy phrase, burn everything English except the coal. So that was economic nationalists obviously wanted everything done in Ireland. So they had this obsession with trying to be self-sufficient in coal. At the time the Newry Canal was built, there were no steam engines in factories. That was still in the future. So any coal was going to be taken to Dublin to burn in hearths for fuel, for cooking and heating and so on. And the coal had been discovered in Coal Island at the beginning of the century, but in 1742 it was not being dug out in economically viable quantities. So they were like betting on the coal coming along. Even when they built the canal, there was no guarantee there would be any coal would be hauled on it. So this boat maybe had coal on it, but it came by cart from Coal Island to Lough Neagh, and then onto a boat. The Coal Island Canal, which had been part of the Newry Canal, had been one system. It was never actually finished properly. It was never successful. It did open in the later 18th century, but by that time the collieries weren't producing enough coal to make it viable, so the whole thing just never actually materialised. But it didn't stop them pouring money into it for decade after decade after decade. They still had this, the Irish Parliament, they still had this idea that we could be self-sufficient in coal and that we should put money into it. And that was also to do with the circular economy of money staying in Ireland. So they objected to the fact that they had to pay England for the coal. So if you can have your own coal, you could keep that money circulating within your own economy. So we're always looking for coal. I've seen some wonderful things around Carlingford where somebody found coal and there was this great rush. You know, it's a bit like the critical minerals thing now. And there was this great rush to think, oh God, there's coal in Carlingford. And it turned out that somebody had actually put coal down a hole. So there's been a bit of fraud going on, I think. So that kind of continues. So the canal's main brilliance was as a transport artery, and that was shown only a couple of years after it opened. Whenever there was food scarcity, there had been crop failures, and they were able to import grain into Newry and transfer by the canal all around the interior of mid-Ulster, and alleviated basically famine. So I think they caught on very quickly that what its proper use was as a transport artery, and I would say that grain was no longer carried after that by any kind of road. It went by the canal. So the canal was a great success immediately, and was very successful for the next 50 years. It had been a prototype of sorts, so there was, by the time we come to 1800, it needed quite a bit of renovation. So the next engineer who was brought in there was John Brownrigg, who had worked on the canals in the south of Ireland, which were by now being built as well. And many of the features that you would associate with your walks along the towpath come from Brownrigg and this 1800 work that was done on the canal. So this is a granite sill of Campbell's Lock at Terryhugan near Scarva. And this lock was completely rebuilt in 1800, as were a couple of others. And so they put in granite sills now instead of the wooden sills that had been in the previous locks before. And you can see the date then. There's a little date stone on the wall of 1802. And this is a wonderful, big, monumental piece of carved granite in blocks that are all set together. And it has stood the test of time. You'll see some of the later slides here have we were able to demonstrate that the lock chamber was basically watertight even in 2020. So that's like 200 years later. So Brownrigg then was updating technology as well as anything else and renovating the locks. And he ended up having to build 3 new bridges, because by now the bog had been drained. So and there was a lot more traffic. There was more agriculture, there was more industry, there was a lot more stuff needing to be transported by the canal. And with the bog gone, then there was a lot more communication across the canal rather than the few passes that there had been earlier. So this is the bridge at Gerald's Pass, which is a nice, unusual shape of a bridge. So he improved the access with the new bridges, and this then he had to build a new harbour at Scarva. There hadn't been a harbour there before. Both Scarva and Points Pass had become quite important villages from being nothing when the canal opened. They now had markets and fairs in them, and in Scarva, Brownrigg in his report detailed that a lot of the banks had been broken down because of cattle being loaded onto barges. There were also a lot of the linen bleachers had little warehouses in the village, and where they brought in the bleaching materials were unloaded. So this little harbour was built, and another quay outside it on the canal was also built by Brownrigg for all the extra commerce that there was. And there was also a salt works in Scarva, which the salt then would have been transported by barge as well. So after the 50 years, you can see how the success of the Tillage Act in its aims and its objects was to drain and improve bogs. So the whole of the Glen bog has been completely drained, to the extent that Brownrigg had to build a new feeder to bring water to the canal. It now didn't have enough. So this picture here is one of the Hinks prints of the linen industry in Ulster. And up here is Scarva House. So this was where King Billy would have sat looking down on the bog. You now look down on people sowing the flax, sowing the flaxseed for linen production. So the bog was dry. As a transport artery then, goods were brought up the canal, and there were actually, I've seen some ads where they were sold at Dublin prices from barges or from little hardware stores along the canal. So they were able to have cheaper goods because of the transport costs were so low. We had the new villages, Scarva and Points Pass, and to some extent Guildford, and the new harbours, all showing how much more industry there was now. So that's the improving and carrying of goods inland. But the biggest difference was in the encouragement of tillage. But it wasn't cereal that was grown; it was flax, it was linen. Was what was the tillage that had been encouraged by the Act, and the linen industry along the hinterland of the canal was the really big success story of the 50 years from the canal had been opened. Because the bog had been drained, there was a lot more productive land there, and the farmer weaver was a very sustainable model of economy, because the linen growing involved the whole family, from the planting of the flaxseed and the spinning of the cloth, and then the spinning of the yarn, and then the weaving of the cloth. And it was a cash crop. The weaver sold his own linen webs at the various markets in Banbridge, Lurgan and Newry. So he had a cash crop there. They also kept a cow, which was for the butter, which was another cash crop. So this meant that on a bad year, they had two different kind of crops that brought in cash. So they always had money for food if their ordinary food that they grew to sustain themselves, if that failed. So this was a very sustainable economic model. It also meant you could have smaller farms, but you could still get good rent for your farm as a landlord, because the linen commanded such a high price. And Arthur Young, in his tour of Ireland in the 1776, he remarked on the Armagh housewives who could drink tea for breakfast. And this is at a time whenever tea in the big houses was under lock and key, and there's Mrs. Weaver's standing drinking her tea at her door. So it was a good life, and it was made possible by the canal being able to bring the linen out for export, and the various bleaching materials and so on in for import, and also the butter was carried down the canal to Newry, and various other products that were made. Also beef, live cattle also moved. So this, oh God, touched the computer. There we are. So this is actually in the museum here. This is painting by Nixon of the sea lock at Fathom. So the inland canal ended in Newry, and thereafter they were dependent on the river for the shipping, which wasn't very good, because it meant that you were dependent on tides, and larger boats couldn't really get into Newry too easily. And we had all this produce that was all being taken to Newry for export. So Newry became like the bottleneck, and the merchants in Newry sort of lobbied very hard, and eventually a ship canal was built. Now this is not the 5 miles of the existing ship canal. In the first place, it was about 2.5 miles long, down towards Fathom, and ended here at Fortescue's Lock, and that was opened in 1767. Victoria Lock didn't come along until 1850, but this new sea lock and ship canal meant that you could bring large ships right into Newry to load and unload. And now this is a later picture from the 19th century, but it shows what it would have looked like to have ships right in the centre of the town. And Arthur Young again voiced his amazement at this, how these 300-ton ocean-going ships were sitting like barges in an English canal in the centre of the town. Which meant Newry was a very important commercial port, and it was an international port. I have some ads here, which I just put to show the variety of things that were coming in and out. So here we have the Corrie, Edward and Isaac Corrie. So that's the same Corrie as was the Chancellor at the time of the Act of Union. So they're merchants, and he's bringing in a parcel of weed ashes and barilla imported from Danzig and Spain, and also pearl ashes, vitriol and American flaxseed. So they are all things to do with the linen industry. Down here then we have Andrew Thompson, who is one of the main merchants and ship owners in Newry, and he is bringing in an assorted cargo of iron and tar, a quantity of best sweet American flour, best New York and Philadelphia flaxseed, best, everything was best Dutch blé flax, black soap and smolts for bleachers, New York and Philadelphia barrel staves, Antigua and Jamaica rum, Geneva, Brandy, London Porter, Drontheim and Christianson Deals, which is timber, Best Sweet Barilla, American Potash, all of which he will sell on the lowest terms. So they're all the kind of quite exotic imports, and the ships would have come from all these different towns that it's mentioning there. So this ship, Judith, there's three mentioned here. There's Judith, John and Robert and New Draper, and they were what they call constant traders. So these three ships continuously sailed like ferries back and forth to England. Judith, about every 6 weeks, went to London with a cargo mostly of linen, and the same with John and Robert and New Draper. They're going to Chester Fair with linens and to Liverpool. So those huge volumes of linen were exported from Newry, both to England and also to the Caribbean. And one of my other research interests is slavery and Newry's connections to slavery. And a lot of Newry linen ended up in the Caribbean. So the fine white linen would have clothed the masters, and the enslaved people wore Ulster, coarse Ulster linen. And so this ship here then, which has come from, soon expected from the West Indies, so that would have been bringing in the sugar and the rum, and also more exotic logwood and dye materials. So that Newry's expected from the West Indies, and then she will clear to sail to New York in North America, and she would be carrying freight and passengers, redemptioners or servants over to America. So that was another main export of the area, was people. Quite a lot of people emigrated from Newry throughout the 18th century. And there is actually a regular shipping service to New York and Philadelphia from Newry. There were about 4 ships continually sailing across. So the like of Newry, she would have made 3 voyages a year. And there were other ships then making the similar voyage with linen, beef, butter, other foodstuffs, and people. So that was the heyday of the canal. From about 1800 onwards, we go into a decline. And the biggest decline, of course, was caused by the railway. So this is Craigmore Viaduct, opened in 1852. And one of the last big carrying contracts on the canal was the material to build the railway, which is a sad end for canal. But it happened across the UK. It was always the canals that went as the railways came along. So the canal continued to decline into the 20th century. You can see this photo now. The town has basically turned its back on the canal. The lower picture there is what is now Basin Walk Car Park in Newry, and that had been a turning basin and was filled in. So that's the Bank of Ireland building there on Trevor Hill across the way. So the canal was just forgotten about, really. Eventually the bridges, the turning bridges were fixed going through Newry. Sugar Island Basin there was filled in. Then there were other low-level fixed bridges were built, and the inland canal was declassified and abandoned in the late 1950s. The ship canal then, Victoria Lock, had been built in 1850, but even by that time the lock wasn't really big enough for the more modern ships that were beginning to be built and come into the town. And the ship canal sort of limped on until 1974 was the last commercial entry into it. It does still exist now, of course, but that's the last commercial. So then we would come to the founding of the Newry and Portadown branch in 2005. So that's Peter, looking 25 years younger, obviously 20 years younger. But Peter and I did a bit of a walk along the canal to see the kind of work that was needed. And this little tree absolutely incensed me because it had been allowed to grow through the stonework, and it's just a tiny mountain ash. But you can see the way it has already shifted the stone out of the corners. So we knew that once that stone fell in, it would be gone forever. So we started to do work parties, was the first things that we tried to do. So that's Campbell's Lock. So you remember the granite sill that I showed you in an earlier picture? This is what Campbell's Lock looked like whenever we came to it in 2007. I think it took us 2 years to get permission from the council to actually do any work. So we started doing our work parties, and that was the before, and after we ended up with it looking like this. Now, it did take more than one day to do this, have to admit. But part of our reasoning for this was that you need to be able to see what you've got to appreciate it, and then our aim was always restoration and reopening of the canal, so you needed to be able to see it. So we were quite happy with that. Then eventually in 2015 we were able to, the branch built and fitted these half-height lock gates. So we dammed the summit level and fitted these gates, and this is what I was saying, we found that the lock was watertight still after its 200 years. So we also built a set of lock gates so the other end of the canal at Points Pass, and that re-watered that 3-mile summit section. So we keep those gates closed in the summertime so that you can use the canal with small boats, and then we open them in the winter so that we're not blamed for any land flooding to the side of the canal. And we had our little first boat rally then, so this is your boat's eye view of the canal with its new gates. We're still plugging away though, but I think this picture is probably sometime very far in the future. So this is a sort of a Photoshop, and this is done, I'm sure it could be done much more easily with AI now, but the boat in the picture is the canal boat that Peter and I owned in England, so we transposed it in the photo into here, just to show what it's possible to do, and that we're still working away at trying to do. So I showed you earlier a picture of the wooden lock sill, which was at McVeigh's Lock. This one here is Waddle's Lock, which is further down towards Newry, and the wooden sill has completely disappeared. So that would have been because Rivers Agency, when they were dredging the canal for its flood alleviation purposes, they didn't know what the bits of timber in the bottom were, and just dug them all out with their digger. So the wall there isn't really being held up by anything, as you can see. So we lobbied the council for years, trying to impress upon them that if they didn't do something with the bottom of this wall, it was likely to fall down and the whole lock would collapse. And they didn't actually believe us for quite a while, because there's a great deal of ignorance in what a canal is and how, what sort of a structure that was and how it was held up. Because there's no sill there, so you can't really envisage it very easily. So we actually ended up putting our own sandbags in every year so that we could try and prevent it getting any worse. And then eventually we got the council to listen to us, and Rivers Agency put in the huge big bags of stones as a temporary measure before they would begin reconstruction. So this is lobbying Armagh Banbridge Council, who own the canal, well, own half of it, Newry and Portadown own the other half. So we were probably 10 years lobbying them to do that lock, but when they moved, they did move properly. So this is Waddle's Lock then restored. So you can see they have replaced the timber sill with a concrete sill because it wasn't there anymore, so they didn't have to put it back the way it was, the way they had to do with the earlier wooden lock sill. So Armagh Banbridge Council really excelled themselves. They spent nearly £250,000 on doing surveying and refurbishing all the locks in their area. So all the locks in that council area are now ready for gates and could be brought back into service very quickly, which is where the branch is trying to go in the future, is putting lock gates like we have at the summit on more of the locks, so you get a longer stretches of water re-watered for small boats. Newry and Portadown aren't quite so good at all. They started off well in the 1990s. They rebuilt 2 of the locks near Newry, which you'll see if you walk down that end of the towpath at Wynn Industrial Estate. There are 2 locks there, but they kind of gave up after that. So this is Forsyth's Lock, which is number 6, and we drained it out. This is the hose from our pump. We drained it out to have a look at what the condition of it was, and we were absolutely horrified when we saw how completely the walls are undercut. So we actually don't know what's holding those up, and nor do we know how far back the void goes in underneath. So we pointed that all out to the council, I think about 8 years ago, and they have finally got it out to tender just this week for somebody to fix that, which is unbelievable. But there are other locks in the Newry and Portadown area that are just as bad as that, so the lobbying keeps going on. So while lobbying is very important, it's not very interesting. And we'd be trying to get branch members and volunteers. So we started diversifying. So these are just some of the things that we do, as well as the lobbying and the conservation work parties. We also have a heritage centre at the summit of the canal near across the towpath from Loch Shark. So if you wanted to put your boat into Loch Shark now, David, you could call in here for a cup of coffee first. So the heritage centre is open by volunteers on a Saturday and a Sunday in the summer. And we have displays inside, obviously, again, to try and explain to people what the canal is. We're just recently we've got funding to make a working model of a lock that we can have in the cottage to show people. One of the projects that we did get funding for quite a few years ago now was to make a guided tour app. I'm a bit of a map nerd, so I did a project where I looked at all the old historical maps of the canal, including those two that I showed near the beginning, and we used those in an app of a guided tour along the towpath, so you can walk along the towpath and follow our little signs, and there's QR codes on it. And there are 30 stops between Portadown and Newry, each of them with photographs and little bits of map and little snippets of information about the canal that we have gleaned from various sources. And again, that's just to promote the history of the canal to a wider audience who might just be out for a bit of a walk. And because there are 30 stops, you can just do a couple every time you go out. So the future for Scarva, we would love to re-water the basin and have the little harbour for small boats. And this is kind of being progressed by the branch now. They have funding application in to make a canoe trail, which will have canoe steps then on the summit. And eventually we would like to have the harbour there so that we could reopen that. And as I say, the canal is 300 years old in 2031. And we have been lobbying for years to restore it and reopen it. And then you find the latest, what would you call it, project, idea, whatever, the Southern Relief Road, which is like a bypass around the south end of Newry, is going to have a fixed bridge over the canal. So this is an interpretation of what that fixed bridge will be. It's only going to have less than 12 metres clearance. So if you've been in Newry and you see the boats moored outside the quays, none of those boats would be able to get up underneath this fixed bridge. Now, we cannot understand the mindset of anybody who would want to put a fixed bridge over a 300-year-old structure that still is capable of being operated. So that's where we're lobbying at the moment, is to try and make powers that be realise their own stupidity, but who knows. So if you're ever talking to anybody about the Southern Relief Road or developments in Newry, you must say no fixed bridge. Because can you imagine your 300th anniversary and you're saying, yeah, but we can't get up here anymore? It doesn't make sense. Anyway, that's all from me. So I'm happy to take questions or whatever. Thank you.